All right, Bismillah. We are now recording, so we can continue. So for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, this is the second session of us covering Saadi's Pandnāma. If you missed the first one, do not worry. They'll all be uploaded, so you can just catch that on YouTube later. So without further ado, we can begin with Pandnāma. And this is class 2, the introduction of the book itself. So I thought we'd begin by looking at just a few old copies of the book. This is one from the Mughal period in India, and it was sold at auction in a New York City auction house for $4,000, this handwritten copy, just to give you an idea of how valuable this text is. And it, of course, you can tell very, very distinctly South Asian kind of miniature style here. And this text had 3 of these miniatures, part of why it became so valuable. All right. And this is another copy that was printed in a style that we call in Persian chop sangi, which means stone printing, I guess, because there were these stone or metal sheets that they would press down, and that was a very innovative style back then. You can see here it says Karima Mutarjama Sindhi. So this is written in a tarjuma or translation in the Sindhi language. So you can say Dila gar qanaat be dastavari. So this is early on in the book. And underneath, for those of you who can make sense of it, unfortunately I cannot, you can see there is a Sindhi translation. And it would be interesting to see if someone who speaks the language could, confirm or deny if the translation is good or bad, or etc. And there's some notes. I think maybe this is in Urdu on the right. This is an edition printed in modern Iran. Although this text doesn't really get much attention in modern Iran, I was able to find a slightly different version. And interestingly, it's called Golestan and Nikbakhti, which means the Golestan of good luck or something to that effect in Persian, or Pandnāma Saadi. And it was printed because of the Munasabat Jashn 700 Saleh Ta'lif Golestan, the 700-year anniversary of the Golestan being written. So a very cool book, and the PDF is on archive.org, and it's very interesting to see this edition. And this is another edition that is printed in Persian, and I think modern day Pakistan, but it has Urdu footnotes. I found that very interesting. They're not fully translation, so I guess this text is expecting that whoever is reading it has some familiarity with Persian, but it has footnotes to kind of explain some of the details that we'll be going over, inshallah. And what you see here, Munajat be dargah mujib da'awat and dar sanai Payghambar alayhi salatu wassalam wa khatab nafs. These are actually the 3 sections of the text that we'll be covering in this class. So, all right, so on that note, we're going to be covering the things that I just read. So it translates to approximately prayers at the court of the responder to prayers, and in praise of the Prophet, and statement to the lower self. And we'll be covering what is the lower self, or the nafs, as we say in Muslim majority languages. And we'll have a little bonus from the Golestan, some related material, similar materials. All right, so without any further ado, Munajat be dargah mujib da'awat. All right, so I decided to, again, I always like to pull up pictures of manuscripts. So this is what we're going to be reading. Karima bebakhshay bar hal ma. All right, so does anyone who's in the meeting now, does anyone want to try reading this? Masum Ali, I know that you can read. We've read together before. Or anyone. Wa alaikum salam. Go ahead, go ahead.
Can I read this?
Please, please.
Okay, Bismillah. Karima be bakshaye bar hale ma ke hasti masire kamande hawa.
Perfect, beautiful. And you are familiar, I can see, with the aruz, with the meters, and how these things are read with the correct wazn. Beautiful, amazing. So there's no correct.
I would like to share one more thing.
Yeah, please.
We have been taught this knot should be recited every night before sleeping. So in India, Hyderabad, we recite this before sleeping every day.
That's beautiful. Night. So you guys recite this every day. Wow, that's amazing. Is it just these 2 lines, or is it more of them?
No, the full poem, the complete naat.
Oh wow, that's so beautiful. That's amazing. You learned. This is why I love to have people participate whenever I teach classes, because I would never learn such a thing. We would never learn that if it was just me talking the whole time. So that's why you know how to sing it properly, is because you had been kind of taught by your elders.
Yes, that's the reason.
That's amazing.
Can I share? Can I read?
Yeah, of course. Please continue. We'll cover the vocab at then, since you know how to read it. Beautifully. Go ahead.
Okay. Bismillah. Karima be bakshaye bar hale ma hasi ke hasti masire kamande hawa nadarim ghairas tu faryad ras tui asi yara khata baksho bas निगहदार मारा जे राहे खता खता दर गुजारो सवाबम नुमा जबान ताबुवत दर दहन जाएगी सनाए मोहम्मद बुवत दिल पजीर हबीब खुदा अशरफ अंबिया के अर्शे मजीदश बुवत मुत्तका सवारे जहांगीर यकरा बुराख के बुगजश्त अज खसरे नीली रवाख. Thank you, brother.
MashaAllah, beautiful. I would have never imagined that this text is recited like that. So beautiful. So now that
Thank
you've
you.
done the honor of reading it for us, we can just go over the vocabulary. So again, that's also
Thank you.
part of, for those of you who've been in classes with me, I love to teach the vocabulary as well. So inshallah, we can benefit from that. But thank you so much, Muhammad.
Thank you,
All
brother.
right.
Thank you.
So asir is captive. So when he says Kasim asire kamanda hava, he's saying we're the captive of the trap of desire. So the full translation is something like, "Oh Kareem, forgive unto our state," or be forgiving for the state, for we are kind of captive of the trap of our desires. The hava is kind of like the desire of the lower self, and we'll inshallah cover that. So the first word of this, karima, means "O Kareem." And actually in the Urdu footnotes of this book that I showed you guys earlier, it explains that "O Kareem" just means Ya Kareem. So, I'm sorry, Karima, the alif, is just like saying Ya Kareem. So if you want to call someone in Arabic, you can say Ya Allah, O God. Or in Persian, you could say Khuda Ya. You can have that alif at the end. And so we see this Saadi Ya, O Saadi, Hafiza, O Hafiz. And this word, for some reason, interestingly, I've never seen this before. I've never seen a text be called by a word in the book, becomes known as the Karimai Saadi sometimes. So you can see Pandnāma Saadi or Karimai Saadi. And I think that maybe it's because they would recite it. It just became known by that first word, Karima, O Karim. And this is, again, we use the same alif as like in Khudaya when we say, "Oh God," or things like that. All right. So then he says, "Nadarim غیر از تو فریاد رس توی آسیان را خطا بخش و بس." Faryad is a cry, and I know this is shared in other Islamic languages, but faryad ras is someone who does residan to the faryad, right? So reaches the faryad, or will actually heed our cry. So he says, we don't have other than you anyone who will heed our cry. Then he says, Toi asyan ra khata bakhsh bas. Asyan is the plural of asi, the people who have sinned, right? And khata is a sin. Not specifically sin, it's more like incorrect deed, but it's of course understood as sin. And bakhsh is forgiving. So he says, you're the one who forgives the sins of the wrongdoers, and that's it. Then he says, نگه دار ما را ز راه خطا خطا درگذار و ثوابم نما. Khata again is error, and sawab is a righteous deed. So he says, keep me, نگه دار ما را ز راه خطا, us from the path of error. Khata dargozar, leave the error, in sawabam nama, and show me righteousness or good deeds. So this is my humble attempt at translating it. O kind one, pardon our state, it is dire, for we have fallen captive to desire. Our cries for help, you are the one who heeds. You're the forgiver of our sinful deeds. Keep us far from the path of sin and plight. Look past our sins, show us the way that's right. So this is a very characteristic of the Persian, Muslim generally tradition. When you want to open up a text, you kind of start it with mentioning God, praising God, and then, as we'll see later, the Prophet as well, and then sometimes you also see the Ahlul Bayt after that if they're feeling very long-winded, if they want to write a long introduction. But and this one, this is very characteristic. They always kind of open with some sort of mention of God, praise of God, and usually lowering the self. So this is a very important part of humility and fighting the nafs, and we'll cover that in a bit. Is you always lower yourself. You present yourself as kind of like a sinner. And this text, of course, it's full of advices. The way that it would always be presented, they would say, it's advices to myself before anyone else. So it's not like I'm here, way up here, advising the people who are way down there. And as we can see from the tone of the text, he's addressing himself. The idea is that we're the ones who need it the most, and if other people benefit, then that's an added, good result. But ultimately, it's for us. All right. So then he continues, Dar Sanaya Peyghambar, and this is taken from. Just decided to take a screenshot from the book and show you. So there are Urdu footnotes. I found that very interesting. So he says, زبان تا بود در دهان جایگیر، ثنای محمد بود دلپذیر. Jaigir is literally something that takes a place. Sana is praise, and Dilpazir is liked by the heart. So he's basically, in so many words, saying, as long as the tongue has been in the mouth, praising Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam is, pleases the heart. So as long as we've had a tongue, we love to praise the Prophet. Habib Khuda Ashraf Anbiya ke arsh majidash bovad mutakka. Habib, of course, we know that means beloved in Arabic. Ashraf is most honored. So in the Arabic language, when you take a three-letter root like sharafa and you put a alif, it means the most. So you could do this for example, the word tahir is pure, and then you have tahara, the root like taharat. Then you have athar, which means the most pure, again, like referencing the Prophet and things like that. So these are little points of the Arabic language, what makes it so beautiful. Anbiya is and I think it says it in the Urdu footnotes as well. Yeah, it says it right here. I noticed that it's the plural. It's called jama mukassar in Arabic. They have a very interesting rules for plurals in Arabic. It means nabiha, which is how we'd say in Persian, the plural of nabi, the prophets. Arsh is of course throne. Majid is something that has majd. So sometimes the Quran is called Quran Majid in Persian. The glorious Quran. And mutakka is the Arabic for takiyaga, or like a place of, leaning. So for example, they also can mean pillow. We call that mutakka. Or, firm wall can be mutakka. But, by calling his arsh mutakka, it kind of means it's like a place of leaning. It's stable, it's firm. So he is the beloved of God, the most honored of the prophets, and his glorious, let's say, how would you say Ash? His glorious throne is a place, a stable place. Savar Jahangir Yekran Buraq ke bugzasht az qasr Naili Ravaq. So he's saying Muhammad is the Savar, is the person who is riding the Jahangir that goes straight, the Yekran Buraq, the straight, fast steed. The Buraq, of course, we know the famous steed of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam that took him to the heavens and back. And he says, Ke bugzash az qasr Naili Ravaq. So he's saying he passed kind of like the portico. And I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of the vocab. But basically, Raval can mean portico or like the roof of a building. But when he says Qasr Naili, which means blue palace, and it has like the dome of the blue palace, it's like he's talking about the world. So the world is like a palace, right? And you can look outside, it's blue. And the Raval is like the firmament, I guess they would also say, kind of like the roof. So he passed that and went off into the heavens. So Savar is steed. Jahangir, which is also the name of a famous sultan of South Asia, of course, means kind of world taker. Yekran comes from yek and ran, so like one goer, literally like a straight path. And Buraq we know. And Qasr Naili is one of these many words that in Persian poetry means sky. So for example, there's also Gombade Kabud, they say, kind of like the blue or purple dome. So this is my, again, attempt at translating. Inside the mouth, as long as the tongue stays, what can please the heart like Muhammad's praise? God's dearest, most honored of prophets sent, whose honor throne is a place of ascent. Buraq, the world-conquering steed he rode, past the blue palace we call an abode. So he kind of passed this earth that we're stuck inside. Now the third section of the introduction, Khatab bin Nafs. So this is where Saadi, and we see this in the Golestan and the Bustan, and many other texts, where he kind of lowers himself, where he kind of, I don't want to say insult, but kind of speaks in a way that kind of humbles him. So there's this idea in the Islamic tradition that even composing a text might be considered an act that lacks humility, right? Who are we to sit and write something? Why not someone else? What makes us so special? So they always feel like they have to enter in with this debt that they have to pay to the reader of lowering themselves so that the reader doesn't, God forbid, think that they're arrogant. So for example, in another famous book, it's a great example of this. Shabestari, Sheikh Shabestari is a great book of metaphysics called Gulshan Raz, or the Flower or Garden of Secrets, where there's a lengthy introduction in the book, where maybe if there was more time in this class, we could have covered it, where he writes that he didn't intend to write this. So I don't think it's a real story, but he creates this story in the book where some emissary from Khorasan is sent where he is in modern day, like Tabriz area, saying, you must write this book for us. We're struggling with these metaphysics concepts where we are, and we've heard the answers, and he says, no, I can't do that. It's not worth my, I'm not worth it. And then they say, no, but please write this book for us. And of course, this didn't happen. It's just his way of kind of being humble. And then he says, I'm not a poet. I've never written a poem. And then he even writes in the book examples of like bad poetry that he wrote. And or like he mistakenly on purpose writes like mistakes in his poetry to kind of show that he's not a poet. And then, after they bombard him, finally he writes the Gulshan Raz. And similarly, Rumi, Hazrat Maulana, in theory, didn't want to write the Masnavi. It wasn't something that he planned to write. He didn't really write anything to begin with. So his poetry was recited. The other lectures that we have, people wrote down what he wrote. He never sat down and said, I'm going to write a book one day. But Hissam ad-Din, his student, I wouldn't want to say pastor, but kind of pleaded, saying, please, we read works by Sana'i and Attar and etc. You should have a similar work. So it was based off kind of the insistence of his students that he ended up composing. So, I don't want to keep going on, but there's so many more examples we could give. The idea, of course, at the end of the day, always is that you always want to present your work humbly. You don't want to come and say, here, I'm the greatest. Here's my, amazing work. So before we go into Khatab bin Nafs, the lower self, it's a good idea for us to talk about, what is the nafs? What do we mean when we talk about this? There's a lot of talk of this in, in Quran, in the Hadith, when you might hear it in khutbahs, they mention the nafs, but what exactly is the nafs? So in the most basic sense, the nafs can be understood as the soul or the ego, but in the Sufi texts, the nafs is kind of understood as the lower self, that part of you that everyone has that maybe causes us to think about or to sin, or kind of, it's, I don't want to say animalistic, but yeah, it's kind of like the animalistic, or as I've written down some of the Sufis, I've said satanic parts, shaitani or hayvani, as we say. It's kind of that part of you that everyone's embarrassed of, that can also cause embarrassment for you if you end up following it. And this is, of course, the struggle in religion and Islam and any kind of religious tradition. The struggle is, how to overcome this. And of course, it's a necessary part, because if it wasn't there, then there would be no need for religion and tests and sin and reward and all that. So this is kind of like a necessary. It's kind of like every story needs an anti-hero or needs an antagonist. This is like the antagonist of the story of our life. So we've translated it sometimes as lower self in English, and as I said, it represents the kind of animalistic or satanic parts. But what exactly are those things? Well, there are 7 things listed. The first is pride or takabbur. So this is kind of what Saadi is fighting against here when he's lowering himself. This idea that we have that we are better than other people. And of course, to some extent, everyone thinks this in a minuscule state. But if this becomes too great, then of course, we've all interacted with people who it's very obvious when they think they're better than everyone. You become like a very, bad person. No one wants to interact with you, etc. And then the second one is greed, or tama in Arabic. And this is, of course, we don't really need to explain that much, but this idea of wanting more than what we need. So there is an amount that's allotted for us in Islam that, in Persian, we call ruzi, or we say rizq, right? This is the amount that's been allotted to us in life. And then greed is wanting more than that. Of course, there's so many statements attributed to Hazrat Omar, Hazrat Ali. I can't remember exactly who said this, but he was saying there's nothing in life that I went after that was written for me, that wasn't written for me, that I got. So if something wasn't written for me and I went for it, I would never get it. And there was nothing that was written for me that I tried to avoid that didn't come to me. So if we want to get a Ferrari and it's not determined that we'll have it, we'll never get it. But if we want to avoid death or a calamity that's written for us, it doesn't matter how far away you run from it. It becomes like the Arabs say, harib, minnak ilayk, I flee from you to you. So if you see someone who is attempting to, avoid death or avoid whatever, sometimes that becomes their destruction. Many, famous movies and TV shows are kind of based on this theme, right? There's like an evil villain who wants to avoid death, etc. And these are all kind of related. If you notice, they all kind of come from the same root. The third one is jealousy or hasad. It's related to greed, of course, this idea of desiring what's more than allotted for you. And this will, of course, based on the statement of, I think, Hazrat Ali, like I said, nothing that you want that isn't written for you will come for you. So jealousy will just make life, harder, etc. The fourth one is lust. And of course, again, they're all related. And then which is shahwa in Arabic, and then backbiting, which is ghiba, which is a big problem, a huge problem that I think, maybe is harder to struggle with than all of these things. And of course, it causes many issues in our lives. Stinginess, bukhl, which, or I think we pronounce it bakhl, but this is maybe less dangerous than the other ones, but still it's good to, to be a kareem, as the book is that we're reading is titled. It's always good to have like a dask mibakhshad, like we say in Persian, a hand that gives. And malice or kina, or having like a hatred for someone. So of course, all of these, 7 things, we all struggle with them to different degrees in our life, and they all come from the same part of us. So you'll notice that people who have, controlled their nafs, if we're able to find these people anymore in this world, the true Sufis, they're usually either empty or nearly empty of all of these things, right? So I've, alhamdulillah, been blessed with the ability to, in Iran and Turkey and things like that, to kind of sit with people who are much more advanced than me and anything related to tasawwuf. And sometimes I'm just amazed by the lack of these 7 things. So of course, you don't see lust in people or malice, but if a word that even seems like it's backbiting comes, they say, okay, let's not talk about that person. Or if you even say anything that's slightly prideful, they check you. They say, hey, remember that XYZ, you were like that before. Or if you act greedy or anything, you can see that not only do they not have that, but they're repelled by people who have these characteristics. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ had to say about the nafs. He says, Al-mujahidu min jahid nafsahu fi ta'at Allah. The mujahid or fighter is one who fights his nafs in the obedience of Allah. And there's another famous hadith that is attributed to him, although I wasn't able to find the authentication of it. Of course, this is one problem that we have amongst Muslims, is especially with social media, we spread a lot of statements that are attributed to Prophet ﷺ and Sahaba and things like that, but with no source. So you see, just it says the Prophet said whatever, doesn't say where it's from. This is a big, it's a big thing that seems small, right? So you think, oh, it's no big deal, but it can have a big consequence, because if something is a false statement and we spread it unknowingly, then we're kind of like part of this bigger problem. So I was able to trace this. It was authentic to Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Tabarani, and things like that, and Imam Ahmad, and etc. So this is kind of going at the core of what we're talking about, right? The true fight in Islam, they always try to portray Islam as related to terrorism or things like that, but the true fight in Islam is the fight inside ourselves against our nafs. It's easy to go fight other people. Anyone, especially nowadays, it's not like hand-to-hand combat. Anyone can pick up a modern weapon and go click a button, right? But it takes a special type of person to fight yourself. And there was another statement, the one I couldn't authenticate, that said the Prophet and the Sahaba, wasalam, came back from some sort of like fight or battle. And the Prophet said, now we go from jihad asghar, the smallest jihad, to jihad akbar. And one of the Sahaba is confused. What do you mean we're going to jihad akbar? We just came from a battle. Isn't that the jihad akbar? And the Prophet ﷺ says, no, that's the jihad asghar. Anyone can run off into battle. The true jihad is the jihad against yourself. Now we're returning to this jihad, which is the harder jihad and the true jihad. So there are 3 stages of the nafs according to Quran, and then in some Sufi writings, they've added 4 more. They've made it 7 stages. But in the interest of time and not trying to spend too much time away from the text that we're here to study, I just figured we'd cover the first 3. So the first one, and the basic nafs that we all have, that the person who hasn't challenged their nafs has, maybe you could say the majority of humans in the world unfortunately have this, is the inciting nafs, and nafs al-ammara. And ammara here, you can see the Arabic word amr is there. This is where the name Amir and things like that come from. The idea is command, right? Amr is like a command. So in Quran 12:53, Hazrat Yusuf says, and I do not absolve my inner self of blame. Surely a man's inner self, and nafs al-amara in the Arabic, often incites to evil. Unless my Lord shows mercy, certainly my Lord is the most forgiving, very merciful. So the nafs al-ammara is the commanding nafs, or the inciting nafs, right? Inciting, it might be a better word because it's getting you to do something bad. And again, this is, I said, what everyone is born with, what a child has, up to an adult who hasn't challenged their nafs. Someone who has this nafs, right, the unrefined nafs, they're commanded by their desires constantly. So the nafs says, go drink alcohol, they go do it. It says, go eat in excess, eat unhealthy food, they go do it. They can't control themselves. Smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, and never quit, and they keep doing it, etc. Whatever bad thing you can think of, they can't control their nafs. And we have all seen people like this who are adults. And of course, in those small things, maybe eating, it doesn't bother other people how much food you eat, but they get angry, they yell at people, they cause problems. The type of person who is commanded by the nafs al-ammara, it's like the absolute worst type of person that no one wants to, be around. And it's very sad, unfortunately, when you encounter people who are like this as adults. They've progressed through life and they're still being commanded like a child. Like this is in some Sufi writings, they would say the same way that a child just does whatever their parent says, inshallah, because their parent wants the best for them. The person who is captive to their nafs al-amara is just like a child who does whatever their lower self says, and it has very bad results. So if you progress one stage, then you go to the self-accusing nafs, an-nafs al-lawama. And in the Quran, in 75:2, it says, and I do swear by the self-approaching soul. So this is from the perspective of God. So the self-accusing nafs is like one step higher than the inciting nafs. So the self-accusing nafs is like fighting itself. So you say, I want to do this, but then on one side, you think it's like the good and the bad, like the devil and the angel in cartoons are fighting. They're saying, no, wait, no, don't do that. And you feel this confliction, right? Everyone has felt this. When on one hand, they want to do something wrong, and then on the other hand, they think, no, I shouldn't do that. That internal struggle, that is the burning, that's the fire of this, this path and tasawwuf. And then the final stage, in nafs at peace, and nafs al-mutma'inna, and we see in the Quran 89:27, it says, Allah will say to the righteous, oh, you with a tranquil soul. So he'll address the people who are truly righteous as, oh, you who have this nafs al-mutma'inna. Mutma'inna can mean at peace, it can mean certain, it can mean calm. But basically the idea is that they've kind of left the inciting, the al-amara phase, and they've kind of also moved past the accusing phase to where then they don't feel tempted by their nafs whatsoever. So in the second one, they feel tempted, but they fight it, they overcome it. And then the third one, there's not even a need to fight. Like these people have, maybe we've all reached this stage, but very few people can ever reach this stage. It's this idea that, there's really nothing bad inside them. Their core is just totally purified. And if we're lucky enough to meet like the true Sufis, the true people of the, Muhammadi path, and you'll kind of see this in them. They radiate a type of peace from them, subhanAllah. All right, now we're going to read this section, Khitab Binafs. So Saadi says to himself, 40 sal az umr azizat gozasht, mizaj to az hal tifli nagasht. So mizaj is temperament, or basically like the way you act, and tifl is Arabic for child. So he says 40 years of your dear life has passed, right? So life is dear not because we love the world. Saadi mentions Umrah Aziz a few times, but because it's a time that we have to it's a time that we have to make use of for benefit later, and we'll see some of that in the Golestan section, right? So you have this dear time to make use of, and 40 years of it have passed. Then mizaj twas halit tifli nagash, but your mizaj, your temperament, is still in the state of a child. You're still like a child's temperament, like the inciting nafs al-amara. You're still kind of following the way a child does, where a child says, I'm thirsty, and just grabs a water bottle, says, I want this toy, and grabs it. And if you try to take it away, it starts to cry. So here, Saadi, like I said, in this kind of humble way, he's talking down to himself. He's saying, so much of your life passed, 40 years, and you're still acting like a child. You still haven't progressed. You still haven't, controlled your nafs. And just a note on the lifespan, because some of us might think, 40 years, maybe he'll live to be 80. What's the big deal? Back then, death was much more prevalent. So I mentioned in the last class that Saadi was living in the Mongol era. There was attacks all over the place. People were getting killed. And of course, a basic sickness nowadays, like the flu, you get the flu, you just drink, I don't know, orange juice and maybe take like a Tylenol, and you just sleep for 2 days, you feel better. Very basic things, like even, for example, not to bring up something gross, but if you go to a different city and drink a glass of water and you get kind of like a stomach sickness from that, nowadays you're always going to be fine. Maybe you'll take a pill. Back then you could die. Imagine you're traveling, you just drink a cup of water that they didn't boil, and just from that one cup you would die. So life was much more fragile then. They were much more kind of aware of their death. And according to his own estimation, as again, I'll keep saying this, but we'll see in the Golestan section, Saadi thought that he would live to be 55 years old. So if he thought, and that probably was a normal life expectancy then, although, like I said last class, he lived to be probably 80 or 90. So he did live to be double the age that he was when he wrote this at 40 years old. But he thought he would live maybe 50, 55 years. So, if you're 40 and you die when you're 55, it's as if you're like 65 or 70 now. You're kind of feeling the burden of death upcoming. So when he says, 40 years of your life has passed, it's kind of like, hey man, you're running out of time to kind of turn or to course correct. So one thing I wanted to bring up and also hear your inputs, inshallah, because I've been talking a long time. I always love to hear from you guys. Is one thing that I've kind of noticed when I spend time reading these texts is that death was always present in their mind. They were always kind of talking about death, and there's this sense of kind of just a calm acceptance that it's going to come. But I feel that nowadays we have this opposite thing where talking about death is it's kind of taboo. No one likes to talk about it. It's kind of rude, even if you mentions like a very kind of soon coming death, it's considered like very taboo versus, I feel like from these texts, it didn't seem to be. And it also seems like in the modern world, we have this tendency of pretending we're going to live forever, right? So we try to cheat the timeline by getting Botox and surgeries and things like that. And the celebrities are always talking about, oh, look, this celebrity is like 60, but look at the most recent photos. She looks like she's 30 or she looks like she's 40 or something like that. There's this obsession with trying to cheat death. So I was wondering if anyone had any comment, maybe, I'm being too harsh, or if you agree, or if you disagree, or if you have any wisdom from your elders that you heard about this, or maybe a note from your culture about, talking about death or things like that. Do you think that this is something, or just generally, you can kind of chime in anything. I'm interested to hear from you guys. Do you think that I'm being, that my take is accurate, or, anyone can jump in? Massam Ali, if you want to talk, I'd be interested to hear your take because you lived in Iran for some time. Do you think Iranians spend a lot of time talking about death and the afterlife, or do you think that I'm incorrect? If you want to talk, of course. I don't know if you can.
Uh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think generally, right, like among Muslims, it is expected that you think about that and like something that you ponder on, like you don't lose sight of it.
But do you think among non-Muslims it's less than us? Do you think they spend less time kind of pondering this, of course, this reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think generally in this day and age, it's kind of seen as something that you try to avoid, I think.
Yeah, it's rude to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Not everybody would like to talk about it. It's an uncomfortable conversation.
Right. I think that Corona kind of changed that a bit because it made death so prevalent. Death count every day. You see these burials. Everyone knew someone who died. Maybe that changed it a bit. But I kind of saw that I was reading about this kind of trauma of actually this idea of facing death. That it was I read about it on some news sites where they were saying that there was a lot of people who were saying it was overwhelming to think about death on a daily basis in Corona. But I didn't see something like that in kind of like the Muslim world. It seems like, we're already used to thinking about death all the time. You see sometimes like pictures of a sheikh who has his grave prepared and he's already like reading Quran at his own grave, like every we say Thursday or something to that effect. Sorry, not to linger on the depressing topic too much, but this is a kind of a very important theme in Saadi's poetry. Like he's always talking about death in his poems. Like if you read the Golestan, like every other anecdote is about someone dying or talking about death or how short life is. And in his era, in the Mongol era, that was very prevalent in their minds. All right, Nilufar, you've raised your hand. I'm sorry, I barely noticed it. Please, I'd like to hear from you.
No, that's fine. Just a quick one. I think I'm from Afghanistan. I live in London, and I think in the West we're sort of encouraged to think we're going to live forever. We live in a sort of capitalist, consumerist culture. So if you contemplate death, you're not going to want to buy and
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
And, that's very true. Absolutely. No, that's it kind of goes against the system that's in place. Like I think that because death is related to religion, it's kind of also taboo to bring it up because nowadays it's like religion is one of these topics that you shouldn't mention to people. It's considered like outside the scope of polite interactions usually. I mean, I don't know how it is in every country, but in America and Europe, that's kind of been my experience. So it's kind of like parceled off. Of course, every human thinks about these concepts, but it's like just something that you shouldn't kind of think about. All right, so now onto Saadi's text. He says, همه با هوا هوس ساختی دمی با مساله نپرداختی. So havas is like a desire or like a lower, like a type of desire that comes from that nafs, like a greed, a lust, something to that effect. And a dam it means a breath originally, just like breath in English, but it also means moment, because the idea is like one, long breath, it's like a equivalent to a moment or something to that effect. In masaleh, this can cause some confusion. I'm aware that in South Asian languages, it can mean spices, but the original meaning of it and the reason that it means spices is like, it comes from salaha in Arabic. Let's see if I can write this down. Yeah, sorry. It's gonna let me draw. Okay, yeah. So, oh wait, no. This is, sorry, it's so small. But I hope that you guys can see it. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Yeah, okay. So salaha, this root in Arabic, can mean righteousness, piety, goodness, etc. But masaleh are like it's like the things that make it good, if that makes sense. Which is why spices are called masaleh, because they make the food good, of course. So just a little confusing point to avoid. But oh, I'm sorry, I just switched screens. Sorry, this is like not my computer. Bring your sharing window to the front. How do I do this? See, now I feel like an old man. I use oh, there we go. Okay, I use a PC. I don't use a Mac, and I'm not at my house, so sorry about that. So anyway, so he's saying sakhtan means to build, but it can also mean like to do. So he's saying you've done all of your things with hava, with infatuation, and havas, desire. And if you read Saadi's poetry, you kind of get a sense that this is true, because he has a lot of love poems, and from his earlier age. So he wrote this text when he was about 50. He wrote the Golestan and Bustan when he was 40 when he wrote this, according to himself. But he wrote the Golestan and Bustan in 50. And if you read his Ghazaliyat, which I have over there, maybe one day we could have a class on it, you get the sense that he kind of broke some of the rules, let's say. Like, he has a lot of love poetry, and he writes himself actually about how people blame him for, sinning. And he writes in the Golestan about how he used to kind of like have some misdoings in Baghdad, and it caused embarrassment for him because people would spread rumors and say, hey, he has like lovers and things like that, and he's not the most religious person, or not like following the rules. And of course, maybe saying this would upset some people, because when we think about these people, we have kind of this like golden figure, like, oh, Sheikh Saadi, as if he never did anything wrong. But even if you read, the lesser read parts of his writings, he attests to the fact that he used to be a sinner, like he used to drink, he used to have like illicit relationships. But of course, he renounces it all. And he, like I said in the last class, spends the last years of his life living in a khanaqah, in a Sufi hospice. But he had kind of some sinning. And this is so him chiding himself for that, saying, how could you have spent your youth doing that? And he didn't even spend a moment thinking about like righteousness. Then he says, Makon takiye bar umr napaydar, mabash iman az bazi ruzgar. So takiya, again, is to leaning, just like it was related to mutakka or takiyaga. In napaydar is one of these interesting kind of Persian creations where we take many words and we squeeze it together, it turns into one word. Persian is kind of like German in this sense, where you can make words by squeezing together other words. So napaydar literally means not foot having. So na is not, pai is foot, and dar is from dashtan, it's like to have. So it doesn't have a foot, meaning it won't last a long time. Iman is safe, and ruzagar are the days, or the times. So he says, Makon takir bar umr napaydar, do not rely on a life that is not paydar, that will not stand, it will just like fall over. Mabosh iman az bazi ruzgar, and don't be safe, or don't think that you're safe, is what he means, from the games of the days, right? So the days are not, they're not trustworthy. One day you're doing well, you're in good health, the next day you could catch a sickness and die, or something to that effect. So he says, 4 decades of your precious lifespan pass. Your nature is that of a boy, alas. You act on your base desires without heed. You never thought about a righteous deed. Rely not on a life that fleets away. You are not safe from the games of the day. All right. So now I thought we would read a bit from the Golestan, because this introduction was a bit shorter than other sections of the text. So with this extra time, I thought we'd look at a related section from the Golestan. And this is actually the text we'll be reading. And I said that I would let you guys read, and I realized that I read the rest of this Khatab bin Nafs section myself. So I'd like to have you guys try to read some of this. Would anyone like to volunteer to read this section? These first 2 lines. All right, I can call on someone. I know some of you guys can read it. I know the ones that can.
I can go.
Go for it, Masmali. Go ahead.
هر دم از عمر می رود نفسی چون نگه می کنم نمانده بسی.
Perfect. Great. All right. And please continue. You know, you can read these two lines together.
Okay. ای که 50 رفت و در خوابی مگر این 5 روز در یابی.
Perfect. So hardam is a breath or a moment. And basi is like bisyar. It means much or a lot. And panja is 50, but he means 50 years when he says panja. So when he says Eke panja raft, oh, you who 50 left, he means 50 years. And then when he says panjruz, he means 5 years. But when he calls them ruz, he means that they're passing as if they're a day, right? So the year passes as quickly as a day. So he says, in every moment of life leaves a breath. Now that I look, few are left till my death. You are asleep while 50 years pass by. 5 days are left. Will you open your eye? So this is 10 years after the original text that we read when he's writing the Golestan. He's still yelling at himself. He's saying that life is passing. You're not taking heed of this life, you know. All right, now, who wants to volunteer to read the next few lines? Safe, do you want to try? I'll call on people. I want to hear from you.
Hey, salam.
Salam, would you like to try?
Yes, sure, I'll like try. برگ عیشی به گور خویش فرست کسی نیارد ز پس ز پیش فرست.
Great. Just one thing. Khish should rhyme with pish. So it's pronounced khish in Persian, which means the self. But great. Other than that, perfect. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
barge eish literally means like a letter of enjoyment, but it's kind of like an enjoyment IOU for the afterlife, if that makes sense. So you do these good deeds and you get this IOU. And when you go to the afterlife, you can make use of that. Then gur means grave. It's less commonly as qabr is more common in Persian, although that's Arabic. This is the Persian equivalent. Pas is after, and pish is before. So he says, Barge eishi begur khish ferest. He's talking to himself. He's saying, send a letter of enjoyment in IOU to your grave. Kas nayorad ze pas. No one will bring it afterwards. Like once you die, you can't do good deeds after death, you know, for your death. Ze pish befres. So send it from before, right? So have it ready for you then. All right. Does anyone want to volunteer to read these two lines? Let's see. Momen. John, do you want to try to read it?
Sorry, I can't read Persian.
No worries, no worries. All right, I'll keep that in mind. Sorry to put you on the spot. All right.
All good.
You know, did you want to read it safe? I see you unmuted yourself. You can continue if you like, since other people are shy.
Okay. عمر برف است و آفتاب تموز اندکی ماند و خواجه گر هنوز.
Perfect. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you.
So he says, برف است و آفتاب تموز اندکی ماند و خواجه قره هنوز. So is life, and barf is snow, aftab is sun, andak is a little, and qarre is proud. So basically he's saying life is like snow and the sun, the summer sun, right? That's the story of life. It's fleeting away quickly. Andak iman, a little bit is remained, so it's like melted away. And the Khaja referring to himself, this is like a sir in medieval Persian. It's kind of like referring to himself, saying he's still heedless or prideful. You know, can he be prideful or heedless? Like he still thinks that, you know, life is here for good. He hasn't taken heed of the fact that it's passing. All right, great. So, all right, Masumali, please try to read this. Since I don't know who can read Persian, I don't want to call on people like I did in my last class. So I'll have Masumali since I know you can read it.
ای توهی دست رفته در بازار ترسمت پر نیاوری دستار.
Great. ای توهی دست رفته در بازار ترسمت پر نیاوری دستار. All right. Tohi is empty, por is full, and dastar is a bag. It's interesting because dastar can also mean this when I'm wearing this type of Persian turban. And it can also refer to a table spread, a dastar khan, and it can also mean a bag. And the idea is that dastar is like a piece of fabric, right? So you can use a fabric as a table spread, or you can use it as a turban, or, I mean, if you can imagine this, literally the same type of fabric, if you just kind of held it like this and, you know, tied the corners, you can make it like a basket pretty easily to go buy things. Because of course, back then there was like no plastic bags. So he's saying, oh, you who've gone empty-handed into the bazaar, meaning, you know, bazaar here is a common Sufi metaphor for life. Rumi uses it as well. And it's actually a beautiful metaphor, because if you think of a bazaar, it's an extremely crowded place where, you know, people are yelling out prices and trying to do their own thing. Like people, it's like a beehive, you know, or an anthill, like a bunch of moving parts and crazy things. Not talking about like a, you know, the kind of touristy bazaars you might see, like they've made the Istanbul bazaar, like a real traditional bazaar, like you have, for example, in Tehran or Cairo, where it's crazy and people are yelling and all these things. You know, that's kind of life, right? You go into this place and you have one objective. Let's say you go to buy sugar. That's your objective in life. But there's all these crazy distracting things, and all of a sudden, before you get to the sugar, you've bought, I don't know, some soap and like some perfume, and you've bought a fresh turban fabric, and you've got all these things, and you've gone home, you didn't even buy the sugar. This has happened to me many times in Iran. I'm sure maybe it's happened to you all, right? So this is the perfect analogy for life. You go, it's crowded, it's crazy, people are yelling, it's full of people. You don't end up even getting what you wanted because of all the distractions, right? So he's saying, oh, you've gone empty-handed into the bazaar of life. We all come into life empty-handed. And I fear that you won't bring a full you know, basket or kind of thing back, right? I feel that you'll go empty-handed and return empty-handed. You won't actually get anything of use from this life. So of course, again, referring to himself. Then he says, هر که مزروع خود بخور بخید وقت خرمنش خوشه باید چید. Mazru is, for those of you who've studied Arabic, you'll know it literally means farmed, like what's been farmed. Khid is unripe. Kherman is harvest. And khushe is just like wheat. So it's saying you, or whoever, it's general, whoever has eaten what he's farmed before it's ripe. So if you go and eat your fruits before they're ripe, at the time of harvest, you have to eat wheat, right? So if you can imagine, if you have fruits and all these things, you go eat them while they're still getting ripe. When the harvest time actually arrives, you could just chew on, you know, hard pieces of wheat. There's nothing left for you. And this is the analogy for the person who's like basically consumes in life and doesn't save anything for the afterlife. When it comes to the afterlife, they'll be, you know, left with nothing. So this is my humble attempt to try to translate it. Yes, I can send the slides into the chat, inshallah, yes. So he says, save some enjoyment for when you are dead. You can't save up then, so save it ahead. Life is a tale of sun and snow, indeed. Little's left, and he's still not taken heed. You go to the bazaar without a thing. I fear an empty hand is all you'll bring. Wait for the harvest. If one eats before, at harvest you'll have gleanings and no more. All right, so that is the end of our presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it, and it was hopefully meaningful. If you guys have any questions, I can take them now. You can just go ahead and start speaking. I can just unmute yourself, and if you know, if it has to do with any of the grammar or vocabulary or anything I said, or just, you know, an idea, a comment, it can be anything. I don't think it's your own free time, basically.
Salam, brother.
Salam, salam. How are you?
Yeah. By the line Khaja Gharra Hunuz, I remember probably بعد از خرابی بسیار خواجه بیدار شد.
So is this from Saadi as well?
I think so.
So he says بعد از خرابی بسیار خواجه بیدار شد. So after a lot of destructions, the Khaja, the Sir, finally arose. Maybe again referring to himself. So yeah, so Saadi in his life, you know, it's so interesting because we a lot of times create, let's say, but or an idol out of these people, where we think Saadi is this holy, pious figure, which not to say he isn't a good figure or anything like that, and that he could never have done anything wrong. You know, the people we look up to are all angels. But I think it's more interesting when you have a true historical look at the figure, you can learn a lot from them, right? So Saadi, it's interesting to see his trajectory in life, that when he was early on, younger, he was heedless, he was kind of, as I said last class, Sheikh Hashab Shukh, the joking young sheikh, constantly joking around. earning himself a bad reputation, where it's even followed him till his old age. So subhanAllah, even that in itself is a lesson. He was a jokester, maybe drank some wine and had some beloveds when he was young. Then he repents, and then even when he's old, this is a lesson for us, by the way, the bad reputation follows him. So at the end of the Golestan, in the Khatamat al-Kitab, literally means ending of the book, he writes that the majority of Saadi's writings are just for learning and education, but people still criticize him and find fault in him. And he basically, in modern parlance, calls them a bunch of haters. This it really goes to show you that what you do follows you for a long time. And he even writes in the Golestan advices, saying, if you don't want your enemies to speak badly about you, don't give them anything to speak of. And he writes that the things that you do, and inshallah one day we'll have a Golestan, or we are having a Golestan class that starts in about I want to say a week. Yeah, exactly a week basically. He writes, that a bad deed done today, you can hear about it many years later. So yeah, we can hopefully inshallah learn lessons from Saadi's life. So, all right, great. Any other questions or comments or anything like that? All right, if not, I won't keep you guys any longer. It's been about an hour, so I don't want these to get very long. So yeah, if there's any questions, of course, there's 3 more classes, and they're going to happen for the next 3 days at the same time as we're having them now. So you could just bring them then. And thanks for everyone for coming. And I hope that I didn't get, as we say in Persian, I hope I didn't give you a headache with all my talking. And I hope that we can all benefit from Saadi's wisdom, inshallah. So yeah, if there's no other questions to the chat. All right, thank you so much for coming to the class. All right, if there's no other questions, and we'll call it a day.